I am live. I'm reading A Lot to Remember. It's a book by Joan Marshall Grant about her travels in that part of France, Lot. And I'm already at chapter 22. And I continue with In Respect of Rivers. Joan Marshall Grant was born in 1907 and passed in 1989. This was published in 1962. In Respect of Rivers. At Condouchet, where the main road tunnels through the cliff as it approaches Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, another lovely river, the Selig, flows through a narrower, wilder gorge to join the Lot. The first village upstream is Cabrerets, with a little hotel, Le Glaubt, where we often went to enjoy a carafe of wine in the coolness of the garden, or for a meal surpassed only by Madame Rochette's. The garden is, in the most literal sense, a summer house roofed with grapevines from which the bunches hung like light fittings, and divided by walls of runner beans and morning glories growing up strings into glorious rustling rooms. In one of them, 2 huge pet carp drowsed in a sunken bath, curved about each other like sleek dachshunds in a basket. Below it, the river widens to a pool, where an ancient angler, somnolent as the carp, moved in his boat only to cast bread on the water, or to gather a foolish fishler from his float. The cliff beyond looks sheer, but there is a path which, toward sunset, becomes a processional of goats led by a little goatherd, evoking panpipes for this Arctic freeze. But even in 1956, such pleasant fantasies were sometimes interrupted by a turbulence of tourists, refreshing themselves after a visit to the Grotte du Pechmerle or the prehistoric museum, which, through the devoted scholarship of the Abbé Lemozzi, is housed in the 14th century chateau that commands the village. Pechmerle is now impressively equipped to receive visitors, but when I first descended into its depths in the early spring of 1938, I found the experience disquieting. I had stopped in Cabarets to ask the way to the cave, and at first thought myself fortunate to have by chance addressed myself to the guide. Surely he must be the guide, for he had shambled off down an alley between 2 cottages and come running back clutching the key. It was the right key, for it unlocked a narrow, rust-stained door at the foot of a steep flight of steps, which penetrated the bare hillside. Inside the door was an electric light switch, which he at first seemed reluctant to touch, until then turned on only after taking a stub of candle from his trouser pocket and casting it over his shoulder. After this declaration of faith in the lighting system, he marched resolutely into the offusc provided by a few dimly glowing bulbs, which seemed very haphazardly attached to the dripping walls. When I realized that we were to explore not a single cave, however large, but a vast labyrinth, I wished that when in search of painted balls I had had the wit of Ariadne, who, when rash enough to seek the Minotaur, had at least provided herself with a thread to follow on her way out. However, retreat was impractical, because the current was insufficient for more than one stage of our journey to be illuminated at a time, and while there was at least a dim light ahead, there was Stygian darkness behind me. I felt increasingly uneasy when he let the darkness flood back for longer and longer intervals between turning off one series of light and turning on the next. But I still managed to pay some attention to the paintings of mammoths and bulls and deer, until he suddenly became engulfed by a hurricane of laughter. The sound bounced from stalagmite to stalactite, until it seemed we were ants imprisoned in a drum. Why does this always happen? I don't know when it stopped, because I'm reading. But I still managed to pay some attention to the paintings of mammoths and bulls and deer, until he suddenly became engulfed by a hurricane of laughter. The sound bounced from stalagmite to stalactite, until it seemed we were ants imprisoned in a drum. Gradually the maniac mirth subsided into gigglings. Words bubbled through, sibilant, lisping words which at last conveyed the joke he thought so terribly funny. He had never been in the case before, because everyone thought it would damage the paintings, but he had proved that he was more clever than anyone in the village, for he had stolen the keys from the guide's cottage, and now he was conducting the very first tourist of the season, and the very first tourist was sure to give him an enormous tip. Pourboire énorme, he repeated truculently, and further to the point, the hint, he turned out the lights. The instinct for self-preservation alerted my wits. I promised to give him a pourboire formidable, but could do so only if he turned back to the car in which I had carelessly left all my money. We must hurry, for if we delayed, my bag might be stolen. Perhaps at this very minute it was being stolen, leaving me powerless to reward him. It worked, but so effectively that I had to run to keep up with him through down slimy steps, along narrow catwalks, ducking under stalactites, terrified that I might get left behind and reach the door to find it shut behind him. Fortunately, he was too impatient to think of shutting the door, and as I reached the top of the entrance steps, I saw him glowering above, down the road, for a sight of the imaginary thief who was coming to steal his well-earned tip. He was fulsome with gratitude when I left him, sitting on the bank admiring the pictures on the notes like a child playing with picture postcards. He looked pitifully huge and helpless in the sunlight. Yet I still wondered if he would have left me to die in the dark if he had realized that my note case had not been in the car, but in my pocket. The silly winds winds on among exclamations of poplars, between cliffs the colour of ripe quince and ripening apricot. The ridge to the south rises to 1,000 feet, and so lovely are the views from each of the 6 roads that, between Cabrerets and Espagnac, climb over the crest to villages on the lot, that I have never been able to decide which I shall first choose when I return here. But I know my favourite village of the Selig Valley is Markilhac, built within the confines of a 10th century monastery, where there is a roofless and magical abbey church burned by Huguenots in 1569, which I found when setting out after luncheon at the smaller hotel to look for a place at which to bathe. The river was too shallow for bathing, but lower down there are falls, where I have lain tranquilly in a niche among the boulders, with my head dry and in the sun and water gushing over my shoulders. Charles, who is a robust swimmer, preferred bathing in the lot, which I also enjoyed, except when the current was running too swiftly. Usually the water is olive green and silk soft to the skin, but after a summer storm has washed red ochre down some of the mountain streams of the upper reaches, it surges along like a torrent of molten copper. The recognized bathing place is from a gravel bank by the bridge, which links La Papille with Tour de Four, but we prefer a sand pit opposite the great crag on which the castle used to stand, although sand is an euphemism, for it was dried mud mixed with fine gravel. Because we could count on having it to ourselves, the only access to it being across a tobacco field belonging to a friend of George's, and along a secret path we had laboriously cut through a forest of nettles. Right, so I'm making a break here because I think my battery is running out. I'm wishing everybody a lovely Sunday. It is the 17th of November.